So Princess Anne just dropped a documented, private account of Queen Elizabeth's final warning about Camilla right in the middle of a closed family meeting at Windsor. And the way she did it was so methodical, so ruthlessly calm, that Charles literally turned away from every single person in that room because he couldn't face a single one of them. This wasn't some whispered piece of gossip that slipped out through a footman or a disgruntled courtier. Anne walked into that meeting with a written record she had personally confirmed, placed it before Charles, Camilla, and William, and effectively told the King of England that their mother had separated acceptance from trust, companionship from command, and marriage from the machinery of monarchy. The palace didn't shake because of a scandal shouted from a balcony. It shook because Anne finally gave voice to a warning that had been buried in silence since Elizabeth's final days. And the entire foundation of Camilla's position shifted the moment those words landed. Before we get into the absolute wreckage this caused inside those Windsor walls, take a second to subscribe to Prime Archive so you never miss when we pull back the velvet curtain on stories like this one. Trust me, you're going to want to be here for everything that comes next. The thing that gets me about this whole situation is the precision of Anne's timing. She didn't do this at the funeral. She didn't do it during the coronation planning when emotions were already raw and everyone was walking on eggshells around Camilla's new title. She waited until she saw the same pattern returning that had terrified their mother in the first place. Anne had been watching this quiet erosion of boundaries, this slow creep of informal access turning into expectation, and she decided silence had become too costly. So she prepared a documented account of written records she personally confirmed, and she chose Windsor specifically because Windsor is where this family settles private matters away from the public, where silence can feel heavier than any official statement. She walked into that room with both hands on the table and forced Charles to hear the warning exactly as Elizabeth intended it. No aides, no secretaries, no protective circle of courtiers to soften the blow. Just the four of them trapped with the dead queen's judgment hanging in the air. Charles stared at his sister like the floor had shifted beneath him, and honestly, it had. The Crown's private authority, the inner power to control royal records, access briefings, and decisions tied to the monarch's role, had suddenly become the center of the room. He understood immediately why the phrase wounded him so deeply. Anne wasn't attacking his marriage directly. She was questioning whether love had been allowed to move too close to power. And that distinction is so much more devastating than any accusation of wrongdoing could ever be. It placed Charles between the woman beside him and the mother whose final judgment still ruled the walls around them. He wasn't just a grieving son anymore. He was king, and everyone in that room understood why that made the warning heavier, not lighter. If he dismissed it, he would appear to place his wife above the final judgment of Queen Elizabeth. If he accepted it, he would wound Camilla where she had spent years trying to be secure. Camilla didn't move when Anne spoke. She didn't ask for comfort, didn't reach for Charles, didn't do any of the things you'd expect from someone whose entire position was suddenly being questioned by a dead woman's proxy. She just sat there with this controlled composure that honestly tells you everything about how long she's been preparing for this moment. Anne explained that the late monarch had supported Camilla's public dignity, and this is where the nuance gets absolutely brutal, yet feared any path that might let personal closeness shape sovereign decisions. Elizabeth had separated acceptance from trust. She had looked at the woman her son loved, the woman who had finally been allowed to stand beside him without shame, after decades of whispers, and she had said, essentially, "You may be welcome in the family, but you are not welcome in the machinery." That cut deeper than anger ever could, because it meant Camilla had won the public battle but lost the private war she probably didn't even know she was fighting. William watched the whole thing with a guarded face, but Anne apparently noticed his stillness give him away. The prince had suspected for years that his grandmother drew invisible lines around the institution, yet he had never heard one stated with such devastating force. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to mediate, didn't offer Charles any escape route. His silence told everyone in that room that the future king had already chosen the side of the boundary. And that's when Charles finally asked the question that was burning through everyone's mind, whether anyone else had heard the warning. Anne looked down before answering, and that pause became its own revelation. Then she named the moment that had convinced the queen the danger was real, the Windsor Blue Folder incident. The Windsor Blue Folder wasn't just some misplaced paperwork. It was a confidential household briefing, a private royal file prepared only for the monarch, carrying sensitive notes about access, authority, and future ceremonial limits inside the family. It had been prepared for Queen Elizabeth during a private Windsor review, and somehow it began moving toward Camilla's office before the Queen had finished with it. Elizabeth noticed before anyone expected her to notice. The monarch had grown frail by then, but her mind still moved with the sharpness of a sovereign who had spent a lifetime reading what others tried not to say. She asked one calm question that made the entire room tighten. Where was the blue folder? Nobody wanted to answer too quickly because every possible answer carried danger. If it had gone by mistake, the mistake exposed weakness in the household's procedures. If it had gone by assumption, the assumption exposed something far worse: the quiet normalization of Camilla's access to things she had no business seeing. Anne watched her mother's face change, and she described it not as anger or surprise, but as alarm. Controlled, unmistakable alarm, the kind that passes through a room before anyone dares name it. The folder concerned internal royal access, household authority, and future ceremonial boundaries. These things mattered enormously because they shaped who could see private information, who could influence decisions, and who could stand close enough to power to be mistaken for part of it. Elizabeth believed those lines belonged strictly to the sovereign line, not to affection, not to marriage, and not to convenience. That evening, she summoned Anne privately and spoke not like a mother wounded by family tension, but like a monarch protecting the crown from confusion. The monarchy, she warned, could survive affection. It could survive rivalry, embarrassment, whispers, even pain. But it could not survive uncertainty over who held authority. Anne heard the weight in those words and understood immediately that the warning about Camilla had been born that night. Camilla's name didn't enter the story as accusation. It entered as fear. Elizabeth worried that closeness to Charles could one day be mistaken for power over the crown, and that mistake could spread quietly until it became accepted practice. Anne buried the warning because her mother still lived, and while the monarch breathed, peace mattered more than confrontation. Silence felt like loyalty. But after Elizabeth's death, Anne saw the same pattern returning, the same quiet assumptions, the same casual access creeping toward expectation, and she realized silence had transformed into something else entirely. It had become risk. The confrontation didn't begin with shouting, it began with a door closing. Anne did not raise her voice, which honestly makes the whole thing more terrifying. She placed both hands on the table and systematically forced the king to hear the warning as his mother intended it. Not softened, not contextualized, not wrapped in family affection. To make it easier to swallow. Charles demanded clarity, but pain sat behind every word. He wanted to know why Anne had carried their mother's warning in silence, why she had let him step deeper into his reign without telling him that Queen Elizabeth had drawn a line he could not cross. Anne didn't flinch. She told him she had guarded their mother's peace while she lived and guarded the monarchy once that peace was gone. The crown, meaning the authority of the monarch and the institution that survives each reign, could not be protected by sentiment alone. Camilla finally asked the question no one else dared to ask: had the queen named her directly? The room tightened around the answer. Anne looked at her, steady and unforgiving in her calm, and said, "She named the danger, and then she named you." I cannot imagine what those words felt like landing in that room. Camilla had survived public criticism for decades, weathered affairs, scandals, tabloid cruelty, and the impossible shadow of Diana. But this was different. This came through Anne with the weight of Elizabeth behind it, and it suggested something far more painful than open betrayal. It suggested that the woman whose approval had once seemed like the last closed gate had accepted Camilla's place beside Charles while fearing the influence that place might bring. Acceptance without trust, companionship without command, a seat at the table but not a key to the locked drawers. William broke his silence only after that exchange. He had stayed near the edge of the conversation, listening as son, grandson, and future king. When he spoke, his voice carried no triumph. He told Charles the issue was no longer whether the warning felt fair. It was whether the monarchy could afford to ignore it. That distinction matters enormously because fairness can bend under family emotion. You can argue with fairness. You can say someone was old, worried, shaped by the heavy pressure of final days. But authority cannot bend. Once boundaries blur, power stops looking inherited and starts looking claimed. William understood this instinctively, and his words made it impossible for Charles to retreat into the comfortable position of the wounded husband. Charles didn't answer. He turned away from Anne first, then from Camilla, and finally from William, as if each face demanded a different loyalty he couldn't provide. The king left the room without resolving the wound he had opened, but everyone understood that emotion had failed to settle the matter. Behind the family's pain stood a colder question. Who truly controlled the boundaries Queen Elizabeth left behind? Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself with trumpets. It sits inside access lists, private seals, locked rooms, and names written on papers few people ever see. After Anne's revelation, the question was no longer whether Camilla felt wounded. The question was whether the Queen's final boundary still had force, and whether anyone in the family had the courage to enforce it. Anne understood that emotion alone would not be enough. Charles could argue with memory. He could resist pain. He could tell himself that his mother's words had been shaped by age, worry, or the heavy pressure of her final days. But he could not argue with the access memorandum Anne placed before him. An access memorandum is a private palace record that sets out who can view sensitive royal papers, enter restricted rooms, or receive confidential briefings. It matters because monarchy survives not only through crowns and ceremonies, but through control of what remains unseen. Charles read it alone, and anger began to lose its shape. His hand paused over Queen Elizabeth's initials, and suddenly the document was no longer cold procedure. It was his mother's final discipline written into the hidden machinery of the crown. The king had entered the room wounded by Anne's timing, but the words in front of him left no easy path back to outrage. They showed that the late monarch had quietly reinforced boundaries before her death, making sure core sovereign materials remained within the direct royal line. Anne watched her brother absorb the truth, and the cost of her revelation settled over her. She had not only challenged Camilla's position near power, she had reopened Charles's deepest grief. Every line he read reminded him that Elizabeth had not simply feared a person. She had feared confusion. The sealed correspondence, ceremonial registers, and private briefings were not ordinary papers. Sealed correspondence meant letters or records kept under restricted authority. Ceremonial registers were official lists controlling roles, access, and precedence during royal events. These things mattered enormously because whoever controlled them could quietly shape the meaning of power itself. William saw the structure at last. Anne had not been acting out of rivalry or some long-simmering sibling resentment. She had been guarding a system the Queen built in silence, a system designed to protect the crown from becoming a family possession. Camilla's public dignity remained intact, but the memorandum made one distinction impossible to ignore. Dignity beside the monarch was not the same as authority over sovereign materials. You can stand next to the king at every state function, wear the jewels, accept the curtsies, and still be locked out of the rooms where actual power is exercised. That's the line Elizabeth drew, and that's the line Anne enforced. Then came the first consequence, and it was devastating in its quiet precision. A message was prepared for Camilla's household, calm in wording but absolutely brutal in meaning. One privilege would be withdrawn immediately. Not a title, not a jewel, not a carriage seat, access. A quiet message delivered behind palace walls told Camilla that certain private royal papers, once expected to pass near her office, would now be held elsewhere. No public statement was needed. The silence was sharper. For the first time, the Queen's warning had become an instruction, not a suggestion, not a family sentiment, but an operational change in how the palace conducted its business. Camilla received the decision with the kind of stillness that made the message feel even heavier. Her household would no longer receive advanced visibility of selected sovereign family briefings tied to Queen Elizabeth's private records. Sovereign family briefings are confidential notes prepared for the monarch and senior bloodline royals, often touching private access, legacy matters, and internal family authority. They matter because they shape who knows what first, and in royal life, knowing first often means standing closest to power. Camilla had just been moved further from that center, and the way it was done left her no room to protest without looking like she was grasping for something she'd been explicitly told she couldn't have. Charles understood the damage before anyone explained it to him. The decision was framed carefully, not as punishment and not as public disgrace, but as restoration of a boundary his mother had wanted protected. That wording made it nearly impossible to challenge. If the king resisted, he would not simply be defending Camilla. He would be arguing against Queen Elizabeth's final caution, and that was a wound no husbandly loyalty could easily cover. He was trapped between tenderness and duty, and both demanded something from him he couldn't give without betraying the other. Camilla sat alone after the messenger left, one hand resting on the arm of her chair as humiliation settled slowly. She had not been stripped before the nation. She had not been named in a brutal palace statement, yet the private nature of the loss made it more painful. It told her that the family did not need public drama to reduce her influence. They only needed to close one quiet channel, and suddenly the distance between her and the crown became impossible to ignore. Charles wanted to comfort her, but hesitation stopped him. He knew every word he offered could be weighed against his mother's warning. If he promised to reverse it, he would stand against Anne, William, and Elizabeth's line of authority. If he accepted it too coldly, he would leave Camilla feeling abandoned inside the marriage she had fought decades to secure. Anne's warning began reshaping the palace immediately, and this is where you see how deep institutional power actually runs. Courtiers stopped sending certain notes through informal channels. William quietly instructed staff that all legacy matters connected to Queen Elizabeth had to move through verified family authority only. Verified family authority means approved routes controlled by those directly responsible for protecting the late monarch's records, not casual access built on closeness or habit. The change was quiet, but it cut deep because it formalized what had previously been flexible. Camilla's people could no longer just pick up the phone and get information that used to flow their way through goodwill and assumption. This created the opening Charles had tried desperately to avoid. He could not hide behind procedure now. He had to choose whether to defend his wife against the warning or confront the truth his mother had left behind. That choice leads to the quietest, most revealing moment of the entire drama: two people alone without the palace between them. When the palace machinery stopped moving, only the marriage remained. Charles found Camilla in a private room where no aid could soften the truth. There were no speeches, no protocols, no carefully chosen statements crafted by communications secretaries. Just a husband facing a wife who felt judged by a dead queen and a king beginning to understand that love could not erase a sovereign boundary. Charles entered carrying the weight of two loyalties, and neither one offered mercy. He had faced councils, ceremonies, and public storms, but this was quieter and far more dangerous. Camilla was not asking about titles or seating plans. She was asking whether the woman whose approval had defined so much of royal life had ever truly trusted her. That question matters because trust inside the monarchy is never only personal. It shapes access, influence, and the invisible permission to stand near power without being questioned. Camilla didn't hide the hurt behind anger for long. She wanted Charles to say that Queen Elizabeth had been mistaken, that Anne had misunderstood, that the warning had been sharpened by fear or age, and didn't reflect the full truth of their relationship, but the king could not give her that comfort. A sovereign boundary is a protected limit around the monarch's private authority, the kind that decides who can enter restricted channels and who must remain outside them. Charles knew that if he dismissed it as mere family tension, he would be weakening the very crown his mother had guarded for 70 years. Charles admitted the warning hurt him because it sounded like a judgment on the life he had fought to legitimize. He had waited decades for acceptance, for Camilla to stand beside him without shame, without whispers, without the shadow of old wounds following every step. Now the Queen's final caution had turned that victory into something fragile. It did not erase the marriage, but it placed a hard line around it, and that line cut through both of them. Camilla's anger slowly gave way to sadness as she began to understand that the warning was not a rejection of her place beside Charles. It was a limit on how far that place could reach. The queen consort could be honored, protected, and publicly respected. But Queen Elizabeth had drawn a difference between being loved by the king and holding influence over the sovereign machinery he inherited. Charles finally told her the boundary would remain, not because Anne demanded it, not because William approved it, but because his mother's final judgment had to be honored. Camilla listened, wounded but no longer fighting the truth. She quietly agreed not to challenge the restricted access, and that single choice prevented the private conflict from becoming a public war. Yet acceptance inside the palace could not stop what was coming beyond its walls. By morning, the warning Anne had guarded in silence belonged not only to the family, but to the nation watching the monarchy judge itself. The public did not hear the warning as a small palace dispute. They heard it as Queen Elizabeth speaking from beyond the grave. By sunrise, Britain was staring at one image, a newspaper front page showing Anne's stern face beside Camilla's lowered eyes under the headline, "The Queen's Final Warning." Suddenly, private royal caution became national judgment. Britain woke to a story that felt less like a royal leak and more like an unfinished command. Anne's revelation had escaped the walls of Windsor and crossed into every breakfast table, every phone screen, every quiet conversation about what the monarchy had become after Elizabeth's death. The warning resonated because it did not accuse Camilla of a public scandal. It raised something far more powerful, whether the late monarch had feared the boundaries of authority were weakening inside her own family. Palace officials moved quickly but carefully. Their response did not deny the emotional force of Anne's account. It only insisted that family matters should remain private, and that restraint was itself revealing. A palace response, in plain terms, is the official wording released to protect the crown from confusion, panic, or uncontrolled interpretation. This one mattered because every word had to do two impossible things at once: shield Camilla from humiliation and avoid appearing to dismiss Queen Elizabeth's final caution. Outside Buckingham Palace, the mood turned solemn. A small crowd gathered quietly, some holding flowers for the late queen, as if the revelation had reopened mourning rather than sparked simple gossip. People did not speak of policy. They spoke of trust. They spoke of Anne waiting until she believed the boundary had been threatened. They spoke of Charles, trapped between the woman he loved and the mother whose shadow still reached across the rain. Then one broadcaster gave the story its defining frame. He called it not a rebellion against Camilla, but a restoration of Elizabeth's final line. And that phrase settled across the nation with chilling force, because it changed the meaning of the entire drama. Anne no longer looked like a sister challenging the queen consort. She looked like a daughter carrying a message no one else had been strong enough to deliver. William's name rose beside hers in public judgment. The prince was seen not as a rival to Charles, but as a guardian of unfinished instructions, a future king protecting the crown before it could drift too far from the values his grandmother had left behind. Charles appeared more isolated, not weak, but wounded by the impossible pull between love and legacy. Camilla remained dignified, yet the silence around her had changed. The monarchy now had to do more than survive the story. It had to settle it before the warning permanently defined the reign. In the end, the warning did not destroy the family. It exposed the line they had all been afraid to name. Queen Elizabeth's final caution forced Charles to understand that love could stand beside duty, but never above it. Anne's revelation wounded, clarified, and settled the matter. Camilla remained queen consort, but the crown's private authority stayed where Elizabeth intended. Charles accepted the settlement with the quiet pain of a son who had finally understood his mother's last boundary. Camilla's public role would remain honored, and the queen consort would still stand beside him in the life they had fought to build. But access to Queen Elizabeth's private sovereign materials would stay restricted. Private sovereign materials mean the late monarch's confidential records, family briefings, sealed correspondence, and protected decisions connected to the authority of the crown. That matters because whoever touches those records does not merely read history. They stand close to the power that shapes the monarchy's future. Anne's revelation, delivered through the documented account she had preserved and confirmed before the family, was no longer treated as an act of revenge. It became a protective act. She had not spoken to humiliate Camilla or weaken Charles. She had spoken because the queen had created a boundary, and boundaries mean nothing if no one has the courage to defend them when the cost becomes personal. Anne carried that cost without triumph. She had waited, watched, and finally spoken when silence itself became dangerous. Camilla accepted the emotional price because she understood what fighting it would do. The queen consort could remain loved by Charles, respected in public, and protected within the marriage, but her place beside the king did not grant control over Elizabeth's legacy. That truth hurt because it separated personal victory from institutional trust. She had won a place at his side, but the crown had reminded her that closeness was not command. William emerged with greater authority, not by taking power from Charles, but by defending the principle his grandmother left behind. The prince did not need to raise his voice. His strength came from standing beside the line Elizabeth had drawn and refusing to let grief, marriage, or family pressure erase it. Charles privately acknowledged the deepest wound of all. His mother's warning was painful because it was precise and because it asked him to be king before husband. This moment meant the monarchy chose continuity over comfort. Queen Elizabeth's warning did not erase Camilla, weaken Charles, or divide the crown beyond repair. It clarified the monarchy's deepest rule. Affection may enter the palace, but only duty can govern it. Anne's revelation did not break the crown. It reminded everyone who it was built to serve.